In the past couple weeks, there was a big budget battle in Congress, and of course, true to their nature, Republicans made sure to try to erode some access to abortion by attempting to cut off federal funding to Planned Parenthood, and instead give money to states in the form of block grants for family planning. They of course knew full well that in states with Republican governors, those funds would only go toward family planning methods and services that were deemed okay by the faithful, and all but take away options that poor women in other states would have, including of course abortion, but also contraception methods like the morning after pill. I've always found it interesting to consider who is consistently making these decisions to restrict options and exert control over young women. It's almost always white men old enough to be grandparents. Speaking of control, the attempted control of some aspect of sex by religious people shouldn't be any surprise. Every drive that you can think of has some specific rules around it, and frequently these are rules that make no sense in today's society, or never made any sense at all in any society. Expressing yourself through clothing and speech is often curtailed. We have curse words that God supposedly disapproves of, though interestingly that list is different depending on what country and what century you were born in. So much for eternal truth, right? There are lots of clothing restrictions in Islam and in some other religions too. Even everyday foods are controlled. If I was Muslim, I couldn't eat pork. Jewish, it would be kosher only. Hindu, well, no more filet mignon for me. And Catholic, no meat on Fridays during Lent. Technically, of course, I think Christians aren't even supposed to eat shellfish at all, but I guess that's the Old Testament, which they ignore anyway. That's a topic for another video, I suppose. I do miss the weekend goat sacrifices, though. Having a child is seen by some as a necessary potential consequence of sex. Yes, for those of you gasping for breath at my saying a child can be a consequence, well, it can be. That doesn't mean that anyone should love the child any less once they're born just because they weren't planned. I have the feeling that a lot of you in the Crocodile Army were accidental children, and I love you all just as much. A consequence just means that something happened that they didn't want to happen at the time. It doesn't mean they want to undo it now, necessarily. This is just another form of control by people that think that since they have someone whispering cosmic answers in their ear, that they should get to decide whether you bear a child or not, or decide what the risks of sex are. Make sex more risky, and that will stop people from having sex with people that they don't approve of, or so the implied logic of it goes. This reminds me a lot of the people that were against making the HPV vaccine routine, even though it undoubtedly would prevent a lot of cervical cancer and save women's lives. These people weren't mostly in the anti-vaccine crowd. They were religious people that didn't want to take any more of the risk out of sex. Of course, the ultimate control mechanism is the one that I think really gets under the skin of the faithful, and that's the power of having the final and ultimate authority over whether new life is brought into the world or not. I imagine that it's just another reminder to them of how high on the ladder of science and medicine we've climbed, and that every time we make a new discovery, we look around and say, well, no God here, I guess we'll keep climbing. So when I think of the women that I know personally that have had abortions, and I know at least a handful, nearly all of them already had children or had children later when they felt like they were ready. For the ones that had kids later, if they brought the earlier pregnancy to term, it would just mean they probably would not have decided to have some of the children that they had later. So for someone that is against choice, to wish that the women I know would carry their pregnancies to term is wishing that someone alive now would probably not be here, and in their place would be someone else. Who's playing God now?